Imagine you're walking out of a museum that's showcasing all these 5,000-year-old ancient artifacts.
Okay, yeah, setting the scene.
Right. So you walk out, you look across the street, and you see people using those exact same primitive tools to, like, cook their dinner today.
Oh, man.
Yeah. You would probably think you'd stepped into a time machine or, a simulation glitch.
Totally. It sounds like science fiction.
But according to this radically different reading of an ancient text we're looking at today, that isn't science fiction at all. It is the default stagnant setting of human civilization.
Which is just a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking a foundational text, specifically Surah Luqman, verses 22 to 32, and we are completely stripping away centuries of, well, religious sentimentality.
Yeah, we are throwing out the incense, the cozy Sunday school theology, all that passive surrender stuff.
Exactly. What we're left with is basically a masterclass in civilizational design and systems engineering.
And if you're joining us today, we really want to invite you into a completely different paradigm.
A huge shift.
Right. We are looking at this material, and we're drawing specifically from the analytical framework of thinkers like Ghulam Ahmad Parwez, purely through the lens of cause and effect.
Yeah, strictly cause and effect.
It's a highly structural, socioeconomic analysis of how human societies either operate through alignment with reality, or they just chase the crowd until they inevitably collapse.
We're examining the actual mechanics of human progress and, honestly, the pathology of failure.
Which means absolutely no hype and no preaching today.
Yeah, none. Zero. We are not here to convert anyone to a theology. We're treating this text as an engineering manual for human survival.
Because the core premise here is a binary choice, right?
Yeah, exactly. A binary. You are either running a system that works with the productive laws of the universe, or you are running on this inherited, completely obsolete operating system.
And to really understand that binary, we have to look at the human default. We have to look at why our brains actually prefer stagnation over progress.
Which brings us back to that museum I mentioned. The source material draws this massive, critical distinction between two concepts, deen and mazhab.
Right, and usually people just translate both of those words as, like, religion.
Yeah, they use them interchangeably. But the structural analysis says that is a catastrophic mistranslation. It completely obscures the entire point of the text.
It really is the foundational misunderstanding here. In this analytical framework, deen is defined as a dynamic, evolving system of law.
Dynamic being the key word.
Exactly. It implies forward motion, a system of governance, and, socioeconomic principles that constantly adapt to new realities.
It's an active posture.
Right. Mazhab, conversely, is blind adherence to the path of the ancestors. It's just the unthinking repetition of tradition.
Like a closed loop.
A completely closed self-referential loop. And human beings are terrifyingly susceptible to mazhab, not just in religious contexts either.
Oh, totally. In corporate culture, politics, daily life, it's everywhere.
Yeah. And to illustrate what happens when a society runs on mazhab instead of deen, the source material brings up the Taxila Museum in Pakistan.
Which is such a brilliant, chilling, real-world example.
It really is.
So Taxila is one of the most significant archaeological sites in the world, right?
Right.
Dating back thousands of years.
Right.
So put yourself in this scenario. You're visiting this museum, you're walking past these pristine glass display cases holding artifacts from 4 or 5 millennia ago.
Ancient history.
Exactly. You see ancient jewelry, iron tools, cooking implements, specifically things like a tawa, which is a flat iron plate for baking bread,
Okay.
and a chimta, which are these iron tongs, and a really basic clay stove. You look at them and marvel at how these people engineered their lives 5,000 years ago.
Right. It's impressive for the time.
But then you walk out the front doors of the museum into the modern village, sitting right next to the archaeological site.
And the contrast is just staggering.
Because there is no contrast. That's the tragedy. You walk past the local blacksmith in the village today, and he is hammering away using tools that are completely indistinguishable from the ones in the 5,000-year-old display case.
Wow.
The tongs, the clay stove in the houses, the jewelry the local women are wearing, they are identical.
That's almost hard to believe.
5,000 years have passed. Humanity has split the atom. We mapped the human genome. We put rovers on Mars. And in this village, the design of the tongs hasn't changed by a single millimeter.
From a systemic perspective, this is a profound productive failure. This is exactly what the text identifies as a museum civilization.
A museum civilization. I love that phrasing.
Yeah, because when a society operates on mazhab, when the highest possible virtue is simply copying what your great-grandfather did without ever asking why human intellect is essentially put on pause.
It's suspended.
Completely. The source material actually describes this as dropping from the human level of cognition down to an animalistic level.
Which, I mean, that sounds incredibly harsh at first glance.
It does sound harsh, but think about the mechanics of it. An animal operates on instinct and repetition, right?
Right.
A herd of sheep follows the exact same migratory path today that a herd of sheep followed 1,000,000 years ago. They don't analyze the terrain, hold a committee meeting, and decide to build a bridge to optimize their route.
No, they just follow the sheep in front of them.
Exactly. And the critique the text makes is that human beings were given an intellect specifically to break that cycle.
We are meant to engage in this dynamic, iterative relationship with our environment.
Yes. But the overwhelming historical default is that humans find it exhausting to think. We choose to operate on a cyclic loop because it's safe.
It's predictable.
Very predictable. The source uses this analogy of the ox tied to a millstone, the kolu bale.
Oh, that's a great visual.
You blindfold the ox, harness it to this massive, heavy grinding stone, and it walks in a circle all day long.
Just constantly moving.
Right. The ox might walk 50 miles over the course of the day, expending massive amounts of energy, sweating, toiling.
Taking the work.
But when the sun goes down and the harness comes off, the ox is standing in the exact same spot where it started. There is immense motion, but zero forward progress.
It's a civilization trapped in a loop. I think about this in modern terms all the time. Imagine if a major tech company, let's say Apple, decided to operate like a museum civilization.
Oh, that would be a disaster.
Right. Imagine if the executives at Apple refused to update the iPhone software because Steve Jobs didn't write that specific line of code in 2007.
We must honor the ancestors.
No 5G, no new cameras. The original design is sacred. The company will go bankrupt in 12 months.
Instantly.
Yet we allow entire nations, economies, and social structures to operate on an operating system that hasn't received a patch in 5,000 years simply because the users literally worship the original code.
It's the path of least resistance, and what is insidious about the museum mindset is that it infects everything it touches.
What do you mean?
Well, if the blacksmith in that village decides to use a modern, machine-tooled steel bolt instead of a wooden peg like his ancestors did, he isn't celebrated as an innovator.
Oh, or
He's viewed with deep suspicion. He is a heretic to the tradition. Any deviation from the established pattern is seen as an existential threat to the inherited identity of the group.
which sets up an absolutely massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Because if blind imitation creates a stagnant, doomed museum civilization, how do you actually break the loop?
Right. How do you snap humanity out of the ox and millstone cycle?
And this brings us to verse 22 of Surah Luqman, which is where this deep dive gets incredibly fascinating.
Verse 22 is essentially the pivot point of the entire civilizational analysis here.
Let's lay out the traditional reading first, just to show how deep the misunderstanding goes.
Good idea.
The verse roughly translates to, "Whoever submits his face to God while being a doer of good has grasped the most trustworthy handhold." Now, if you read that with standard religious framing, submitting your face to God sounds like a call for religious conversion.
Yeah, it sounds like physical prostration. Putting your forehead on the ground, joining a specific religious group, and just passively waiting for divine favor.
It reads as an act of pious, quiet surrender, a retreat from the mechanics of the real world.
But the structural analysis completely explodes this myth.
No.
It takes the original Arabic Aslama wa shahu and completely strips away the medieval theology. In this framework, Aslama wa shahu is an engineering posture.
An engineering posture, I love that.
Yeah. Waj, which is usually translated as face, actually represents one's entire personality, direction, focus, and purpose. It is the sum total of your intent and your societal direction.
So it's not literally your physical face.
Not at all. And to submit it, Aslama, doesn't mean to cower in fear or sit quietly in a monastery. It means to structurally align.
Like meshing gears in a transmission.
Exactly. Or aligning the steel beams of a skyscraper to distribute weight perfectly. You are orienting your entire socioeconomic operating framework toward the productive, objective law of the universe.
This linguistic reframing changes the entire trajectory of the text. You're basically aligning the hull of your civilization with the hydrodynamic laws of the water.
Yes. And when you do that, the verse says you grasp the Al-Urwatul-Wuthqa, the most trustworthy handhold.
Which sounds a bit abstract until you understand the context.
Right. To understand the gravity of that phrase, we have to look at the environment of the ancient Arabs who first heard it. In a harsh, unforgiving desert ecosystem, a trustworthy handhold wasn't just a rope.
What was it?
They used this specific root concept to describe a certain type of date palm tree. This was a tree whose roots went so incredibly deep into the subterranean water table that it never lost its green leaves, even in the most brutal multi-year droughts.
Wow.
It was the one thing in the desert you could absolutely rely on to not break, to not die, and to provide sustenance when everything else was literally turning to dust and blowing away.
That is a phenomenal visual. So when the text says to grasp the trustworthy handhold, it is giving a very specific directive.
It's saying stop trying to negotiate with reality based on superstition. Stop chasing the fleeting trends of the crowd and anchor your society to the immutable, deep-rooted laws of cause and effect.
Because that structural alignment is the only thing that won't betray you when the economic, ecological, or political drought hits.
Exactly. And this requires us to completely redefine faith.
Right.
In this context, faith is not mere belief in the unseen. It's not wishing upon a star. Faith is absolute confidence in the systemic laws of reality.
It's knowing that if you align with the structural rules of the universe will yield productive results.
Yes, it requires immense active intellect. It is the absolute polar opposite of blind tradition.
I want to break down an analogy from the source material that illustrates this tension between permanent universal laws and dynamic human intellect. It's the hockey field analogy.
Oh, this is a great one.
It completely revolutionized how I view the concept of divine law. Because usually, when people hear immutable laws of God, they immediately think of a straitjacket.
Right. They think of a system that micromanages every single second of their lives and strips away all creativity.
That is the mazhab view of law, a list of thousands of tiny restrictions.
Don't do this, don't step there.
But the hockey pitch analogy turns that upside down. Think of the universal productive law as a massive sports field. The outer boundary lines are drawn in thick, white chalk, and they are absolutely non-negotiable.
The boundaries are set.
The size of the goal is fixed. The fundamental rules of physics governing how the ball or puck moves across the surface are immutable. These are the hoodoo, the permanent limits.
You can't change them.
Right. You cannot just pick up the ball with your hands in soccer, and you can't redefine the goalposts in the middle of the game just because you're losing. The boundaries are fixed.
Because the structural integrity of the game depends on those fixed boundaries. If you don't have them, you don't have a game.
But, and this is the genius of the system, inside those boundary lines, the players are entirely free. In fact, they aren't just free. They are required to use their maximum intellect, agility, and creativity to navigate the game.
The coach doesn't hand the player a script detailing exactly which blade of grass to step on at minute 34.
No. The system doesn't micromanage. It provides the immutable framework and then demands that human beings use their reason to adapt to the ever-changing dynamics of the match.
Because the opposing team moves, the weather changes, player stamina drops.
And you have to dynamically adjust your strategy while staying inside the lines.
If we extrapolate this to civilizational design, a society's job is to take those permanent principles, things like justice, equity, objective truth, the protection of life and property, and figure out how to practically apply them to their specific era. The permanent law dictates that an economy must be free of exploitation. That is the boundary line. But the dynamic application means the economic mechanism of a 7th century agricultural hub will look entirely different from the economic mechanism of a 21st century digital globalized society.
Exactly. And the problem with the museum civilization is that they confuse the temporary tactics of a previous game with the permanent boundary lines.
Yes.
They're literally out on the field playing modern hockey, but refusing to pass the puck because they are frantically flipping through a 1,000-year-old playbook to see what a player in the 12th century did.
It is a profound failure of intellect.
The source highlights the absurdity of this beautifully. It points out how modern people who fly in airplanes, communicate instantly across the globe using satellites and utilize the absolute bleeding edge of quantum physics, will sit around arguing over ancient fatwas.
It's so contradictory.
They will argue over what length of sword is permissible to carry or what medieval tax code to apply to cryptocurrency.
The boundaries of the field are fixed, but the application must evolve. If you do not evolve the application, you are not actually playing the game.
You're just a spectator.
Worse, you are just standing frozen on the field, proudly quoting dead players while the opposing team scores on you repeatedly.
But wait, if this engineering alignment is so logical and the universe provides such clear boundaries, Why do so many civilizations that claim to be deeply religious still fail spectacularly?
That's the big question.
Why is there so much poverty, corruption, and systemic collapse in societies that loudly proclaim they follow God? The text actually diagnoses this cognitive dissonance perfectly
Yeah.
in verses 25 and 26.
It does, and it completely dissects the psychology of the crowd. Verse 25 points out a fascinating phenomenon. If you ask the general masses, the people on the street, who created the heavens and the earth, they will readily and loudly answer, God.
Right, everyone nods along. The universe has a creator. The planets orbit on schedule.
But then, the moment you zoom in from the macro level of astrophysics and ask them to apply that same systemic logic to their personal lives, their society, their economics, their justice system, they completely reject it.
But they don't want any part of it.
They retreat back to ancestral superstition. They prefer the safety of the herd.
This is the macro-micro disconnect. It's one of the most brilliant observations in the text. People will happily acknowledge that gravity is real, that thermodynamics cannot be cheated, that the macro-universe operates on a flawless, unbribable system.
Sure, they accept physics.
But when it comes to sociology, when it comes to economics, suddenly they think the universe cares about their tribal identity. They think they can cheat the system.
Wiki exception.
Exactly. They think, oh, our civilization can be corrupt, inequitable, and unthinking, but we will be saved from collapse because we belong to the right religion.
It is treating reality like it has a VIP list. We intellectually acknowledge cause and effect out there in the cosmos, but we refuse to apply it to our own behavior. We know the systemic laws of physics work. If you jump off a roof, you fall, regardless of what you believe. But we refuse to let the systemic laws of societal collapse change our behavior.
And the source gives us a razor-sharp historical example to ground this concept. It brings up the geopolitics of the Cold War.
This is a really interesting application.
Now, to be clear to you, the listener, we aren't taking a geopolitical stance here or endorsing this specific political critique.
Right, just reporting the analysis.
We're just relaying how the source material uses this historical era as a textbook case of structural manipulation.
It is a prime example of weaponizing the concept of the divine.
So, during the Cold War, you have the Western capitalist powers facing off against the Soviet Union. The West realized they needed to build a massive global coalition to contain the Soviets.
Okay.
That's what they do. They looked at the vast, geographically crucial populations of the Middle East and Asia, and they rolled out a marketing campaign. The slogan was essentially, "Believers in God, unite against the atheists."
The political architects weren't calling for a global alignment with the immutable productive laws of the universe.
Not at all.
They weren't asking these nations to build equitable economies or advance human intellect. They were using the word God merely as a tribal marker, a political jersey.
It was a superficial label. They were saying, hey, you guys wear the God jersey, we wear the God jersey, let's team up against the guys in the atheist jersey.
Yeah.
It was completely devoid of any actual alignment with the systemic demands of the text we were discussing.
All right.
Saying, I believe in God, meant absolutely nothing structurally. It was just a tool to mobilize the crowd and secure strategic oil reserves and military bases.
And this instrumentalization of faith is as old as humanity. There is a deeply cynical yet revealing historical anecdote that the source uses to illustrate how humans use the divine as a tool.
Let's hear it.
A Brahmin priest is sitting outside a temple with a few pieces of bread. A stray dog comes up, snatches the bread, and starts to run away. The priest, enraged and having nothing else within reach to throw, grabs the sacred clay idol of the deity he was just worshipping and hurls it at the dog to get his bread back.
Wow, he uses the object of his worship as a physical projectile.
Exactly. When push comes to shove, the divine is just discarded or weaponized to protect immediate physical interests.
That is wild.
During the Cold War, the concept of God was thrown like that clay idol. It proves that simply declaring a belief in a creator, simply answering God when asked who made the heavens, is meaningless.
Because the universe doesn't care about your labels or your marketing campaigns or your political alliances. The universe only recognizes structural alignment.
Right.
Okay, let me push back on this a bit.
Yeah.
If the universe doesn't care about our labels, and it only cares about this massive systemic law of cause and effect, just how big is this law?
That's a fair question.
Because if we are supposed to align our entire civilization to it, we need to know the scale.
Yeah.
Does the text actually claim this law covers every single variable? Because verse 27 uses some incredible imagery.
Verse 27 is where we transition from the boundaries of the law to the sheer magnitude of it.
The text says, If all the trees on Earth were pens and the sea were ink, supplemented by 7 more seas, the words of God would not be exhausted.
Right.
Now, from a modern, rational perspective, that just sounds like poetic hyperbole. It sounds like an ancient writer trying to sound majestic. Oh, the sea is ink and the trees are pens. Is this just divine verbosity? Because it sounds like it.
It is a totally natural reaction to read it as poetry.
Yeah.
But if we stick to the structural engineering analysis, we find it isn't hyperbole at all.
Really?
It is a highly precise mathematical and systemic statement. It is about the inexhaustibility of the productive law and the absolute infinite nature of consequence.
Break down the mechanics of that. How is a sea of ink a mathematical statement?
Think about the variables in the universe. The source explains that human intellect, while powerful, is finite. Our accounting systems, our computer models, our predictive algorithms, they all have hard limits.
Sure, we can only crunch so much data.
We can only process so many data points. But the universal laws, the words of God in this metaphor, are infinite in their combinations and consequences. You cannot enumerate or predict every single downstream application of a complete law. The system is richer in variables than we can ever map out.
So it's like trying to calculate the physics of fluid mechanics.
Yes, that is the perfect analogy. You can understand the governing macro dynamics of fluid mechanics. You know how water behaves under pressure.
Right.
But you cannot map the specific trajectory, the exact spin, the velocity, and the microscopic collision of every single subatomic water molecule in a tsunami.
Right. If you tried to write down the exact mathematical coordinates of every interaction of every particle in the universe, you could use every tree as a pen and every ocean as ink, and you would run out of materials before you even scratched the surface.
Exactly.
The variables are literally inexhaustible.
And what Parwez's analysis is pointing out is that because the law is infinite and our intellect is finite, we cannot micromanage reality.
We just don't have the processing power.
We cannot write a legal code or a fatwa covering every conceivable micro-scenario for the rest of human history. That is the ultimate folly of the museum civilization. They think they can freeze the infinite.
They think the 5,000-year-old Tong is the final, perfect iteration of the law.
They think they captured the ocean in a teacup. But the text is saying the law is so vast, so incredibly deep, that you have to constantly dynamically adapt to it.
You can only align the hull of your ship with the fundamental direction of the current, knowing that the specific micro-level consequences will be handled by the inexhaustible system.
And that brings up the absolute core mechanism of those consequences. How does this infinite system interact with human beings? How do we, with our finite minds, experience this inexhaustible law?
Which transitions us seamlessly into the physics of time. We've talked about space, boundaries, and scale. Now we have to talk about the cosmic clock.
This is crucial.
Verses 29 and 30 introduce 2 highly technical concepts that we really need to unpack: Ajal Musama and Mukafat Amal.
The verses use the imagery of the alternation of night and day and the subjugation of the sun and moon. And crucially, it says each is running to an appointed term. The Arabic phrase is Ajal Musama.
Now, traditional theology just reads appointed term and thinks, okay, that means doomsday, the end of the world.
Yes, but the structural reading identifies this as something much more immediate and systemic. Ajal Musama is the designed consequence horizon.
Designed consequence horizon.
Every single process in the universe, whether it's a star burning through its hydrogen, a seed growing into a tree, or a government implementing a new macroeconomic policy, has a natural gestation period. It has a specific amount of time it takes to reach its completion point.
And this is where the engine of reason kicks in. The concept of Mukafat Amal, the law of requital. I want to spend some time on this because understanding this law changes everything about how a society operates.
Mukafat Amal is the absolute bedrock of this civilizational framework. It means that every single action has a built-in consequence.
It's not magic.
It is not an arbitrary punishment handed down by an angry deity sitting on a cloud throwing lightning bolts at sinners. It is a mathematical certainty. If you plant a mango seed, you will get a mango tree. If you plant a poisonous weed, you will get poison.
But, and this is where human psychology completely breaks down, you will not get the mango tree tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
The process must run to its Ayal Musama, its appointed term. The consequence is delayed by the gestation period.
And human beings are incredibly impatient. We operate on tiny, short-term timelines. A society implements a corrupt policy or builds an economy based entirely on the exploitation of the working class. And when the sky doesn't fall the very next morning, they think, oh, we got away with it.
The laws of reality don't apply to us.
We outsmarted the system.
Yes, it's like the 2008 financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
For years, Wall Street bankers were creating toxic, subprime mortgage assets. They were building an economy on a foundation of sand. And year after year, they made billions. They looked at the universe and said, see, we aren't sinking. But the cosmic clock was still ticking. The Ijal Muzama for that specific economic action hadn't arrived yet.
It was gestating.
The consequence was gestating. And when the appointed term hit, the entire global economy collapsed. Human arrogance does not shorten or cancel the consequence cycle.
Or think about climate change. We pump carbon into the atmosphere for a century, and because the temperature didn't spike by 10 degrees in 1950, we assumed there was no consequence.
Yeah.
We confused the delay of the consequence with the absence of the consequence.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. We confuse the delay of consequence with the absence of consequence. And this source draws a fascinating connection here to modern physics, specifically referencing the philosopher Henri Bergson and the physicist Albert Einstein.
Oh, this part is amazing.
It looks at how humans perceive time versus how the universe actually operates.
The continuum of time. This is where the imagery of the night merging into the day becomes so profoundly scientific. The verse doesn't say the day switches off and the night switches on. It says they merge into one another.
Right. Human beings slice time into discrete, comfortable little boxes for our own mental convenience. We look at a clock and say, okay, it is now exactly 5:00 p.m. on a Tuesday.
We love categories.
We draw artificial lines on a calendar, we put notches on the measuring stick, but in reality, time is a fluid, indivisible continuum.
The sun doesn't just snap off like a light bulb so that instantly it's pitch black. The light seamlessly, invisibly bleeds into the dark. It is a continuous, unbroken transition.
And Parwes applies this continuous physics directly to human actions. Just as light seamlessly transitions to dark without a sudden, jarring jump, human actions seamlessly weave into their inevitable consequences.
They're tethered together.
The law of requital runs on the exact same continuous clock as the cosmos. You cannot cheat the consequence horizon because the consequence is organically, physically attached to the action. They're the exact same event, just separated by the flow of time.
The action is the seed. The consequence is the tree. You cannot have one without the other. This completely reframes the primitive idea of divine judgment.
It's not a courtroom.
It is not a courtroom trial at the end of the world where a judge weighs your deeds on a magical scale. It is just the universe organically balancing its checkbook.
And when a civilization drifts from the productive order, when they abandon the deep-rooted palm tree and start worshiping the 5,000-year-old tong or building their economy on exploitation, they are planting seeds of decay.
They're dooming themselves without realizing it.
They might enjoy the shade of their artificial success for a few generations, but the structural rot is working its way through the timber. The consequence is inexhaustible and absolutely inevitable.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of the text. Because sitting at 30,000 feet talking about cosmic clocks and systemic laws and infinite oceans of consequence is intellectually stimulating, but what does it actually look like in practice?
Right. Bring it down to earth.
To wrap up its argument, the text gives us one final, incredibly vivid life or death metaphor in verses 31 and 32.
The physics of survival and the panic button. The metaphor of the ship at sea.
Think about the physics of a modern ship. You have a massive vessel made of iron and steel weighing thousands of tons. By all intuitive, primitive logic, if you drop a massive chunk of iron into the ocean, it should sink straight to the bottom like a stone.
But the ship floats effortlessly. It cuts through the waves.
Exactly.
And it does so because the engineers who built it didn't rely on superstition. They aligned the hull with the strict, immutable laws of physics. They understood water displacement, buoyancy, weight distribution, and equilibrium.
They aligned with the hoodooed, the boundaries of the universe.
Exactly. And as long as the ship maintains that structural alignment, it rides the ocean safely. It doesn't matter if the water is 10 feet deep or 10,000 feet deep. The law of buoyancy sustains it.
It works anywhere.
But what happens if humans disrupt that balance? What if the passengers decide they all want to go stand on the left side of the ship to look at a whale?
Oh, boy.
Or what if the cargo masters overload the hold unevenly because they're greedy and want to transport more goods than the ship was designed for? They violate the law of equilibrium.
And the ocean does not care about their excuses. The ocean doesn't care if they are wearing the right tribal markers or if they have the right religious labels on their passports.
The ocean is ruthless.
The physical law of gravity and displacement takes over, the ship lists to one side, and it begins to sink.
And here is where the text delivers its sharpest sociological critique. What do the passengers do when the ship starts sinking due to their own engineering failure?
They panic.
They hit the panic button. They suddenly remember God. They drop to their knees on the slanting deck and pray frantically for a miracle. "Oh Lord, save us from the storm. Suspend the laws of gravity to save us from our own stupidity."
They reduce the vast, structural, infinite law of the universe to a cosmic lifeguard. They treat reality like a vending machine. They only punch the buttons when they need an emergency rescue.
But the text notes the supreme hypocrisy of the crowd. Let's say they survive. Let's say a freak gust of wind temporarily rights the ship and they manage to limp back to the safety of the shore. The absolute second their feet touch dry land, what do?
They forget the systemic laws all over again. They go right back to their arbitrary, unbalanced, exploitative ways. They go back to the museum civilization.
It is the ultimate indictment of superficial religion. They don't want an operating system, they want a magic trick.
Yeah, a get-out-of-jail-free card.
But the text explicitly contrasts this panic-driven crowd with a specific type of person. It says the signs of reality are clear for those who possess Sabar. Now, Sabar is a concept we absolutely have to dissect, because I've always heard it translated simply as patience. Like, just sit quietly, endure the pain, and suffer through it.
Yes, that is the traditional mazhab translation. Passive suffering. The idea that if you just tolerate injustice quietly, you will be rewarded later.
But that's not what it means structurally.
Structurally, linguistically, Sabar means something entirely different in this context. The root of the word relates to steadfastness, to binding something tightly, to reinforcing a structure.
And the source gives an incredible nautical definition for it.
It does. In ancient seafaring, Sabar referred to the heavy stones or the dense ballast that sailors would purposefully place deep in the very bottom of the ship's hull.
The ballast stones. I want to explore the physics of this because it is brilliant. Why do you put heavy stones in the bottom of a ship? You aren't trying to weigh it down to sink it.
No.
You put them there to lower the ship's center of gravity. You place them there to provide permanent equilibrium. So when the violent storm hits, when the massive waves crash against the side of the boat and try to capsize it, those saber stones hold the ship steady.
They provide the necessary counterweight against the chaos of the ocean.
So Sabar is not crying quietly in the corner while your ship sinks. Sabar is the active, structural resilience you build into your society before the storm ever hits.
Yes. And how does that translate sociologically? What are the ballast stones of a civilization?
What are they?
It's an equitable justice system. It's a fair economy where wealth isn't hoarded by a tiny elite. It's an education system built on rational inquiry, not blind tradition.
That makes so much sense.
When you build a society on justice and equity, you are putting Sabar in your hull. When an economic depression hits or a geopolitical storm rolls in, the society doesn't capsize into civil war or fascism because the structural ballast of justice holds it steady.
The crowd relies on panic and emergency prayers. The people of Sabar rely on structural integrity. Alignment with the productive law provides permanent equilibrium. Crowd following only works when the water is perfectly calm.
That is a staggering reframing. If your society is built on exploitation, blind tradition, and PR spin, you have an empty hull. You might look grand floating in the harbor, but the first real wave will roll you completely over.
And that brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. If we pull all these threads together, the 5,000-year-old tongs in the Taxila Museum, the deep-rooted palm tree in the desert, the hockey field, the inexhaustible ink of the universe, the continuum of the cosmic clock, and the ballast stones in the sinking ship.
It's a grand comparative civilizational analysis.
It's the permanent principle versus the changing variables.
Yes. The overarching thesis of Surah Luqman verses 22 to 32 is that there are fundamentally only two operating modes for human existence.
The ultimate binary choice.
You either submit, produce, build, and align with the productive law. You grab the trustworthy handhold, you operate the dynamic dean, or you chase the crowd and its inherited justifications. You run the stagnant mazhab.
And we have to reiterate, because it's so important, the text isn't saying the crowd is inherently evil or full of malicious supervillains. The crowd is just incredibly expensive and dangerous to follow when it has drifted from the productive order.
It is the path of least resistance, leading directly to the cliff edge. The crowd is intellectually lazy. The crowd is the ox on the millstone. And what is fascinating and what we have to recognize today is that the superficial justifications of the crowd change in every single era.
Right. Thousands of years ago, the justification for not thinking was ancestor worship. We have to do it because the mountain spirits say so, and my grandfather said so.
Yesterday, the justification was nationalism or political tribalism. My country, right or wrong.
Today, it might be consumerism or corporate groupthink or viral consensus on social media. We have to do this because it's trending or because the algorithm says so.
The jewelry changes, the technology changes, but it is still the exact same museum civilization.
But the underlying law of reality, the hoodooed, the physics of the ship, the inexhaustibility of consequence, the cosmic clock, remains absolutely identical.
The universe does not care if you are blindly copying a 5,000-year-old tongue or blindly copying a 5-minute-old TikTok trend. If your actions lack structural alignment with reality, your ship will eventually sink.
So we've stripped away the sentimentality, we've looked at the engineering blueprint, and now as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to address you, the listener, directly. We promised a reality check, and here it is.
Here's the challenge.
I want you to take a hard, unsparing audit of your own life. Look at the company you work for. Look at your local community. Look at your own daily habits and the assumptions you make about the world.
Ask yourself if you're actually thinking.
Ask yourself, are your core decisions driven by a structural, objective alignment with reality? Are you dynamically engaging your intellect within the boundaries of the field? Or are you just wearing the 5,000-year-old jewelry of the crowd because it's what everyone else is doing?
Because the storm is coming.
When the inevitable storm hits, when the Ashal Muzama of your actions arrives, what is in your hull? Have you spent the time placing the heavy, stabilizing stones of structural integrity, justice, and critical thought into the bottom of your ship?
Or will you panic?
Will you just be another passenger, sliding across the slanting deck, desperately hitting the panic button and hoping the universe suspends its laws just for you?
Usually when we talk about ancient wisdom, we want the comforting lie.
We want the clean break on the X-ray, the magic wand to make the murky waters clear, the incense, and the easy answers.
But true wisdom isn't a magic wand.
No, it is a blueprint for a ship that won't sink. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.